Hey everyone. Everyone's awake now that we've been frozen by the photos. So we're going to have like 3 short presentations and then a discussion after that.
We're living in this sort of 10% world. No matter what you're studying or the metric, it turns out that when you look back in time, it used to be about 90% more of that thing. So the fish used to be 90% bigger. We used to catch 90% more big fish. There used to be 90% more coral, whatever it is. The world that we're living in is an order of magnitude less than it was, several generations ago. I spent about 18 months of my PhD just going from archive to archive. I was looking for anything that would give a clue about long-term change. I went to a small archive in Key West, Florida, that had a really knowledgeable archivist there. He brought out this stack of photos that show people catching these massive fish from the 1950s on. This is from 1958 in Key West, Florida. It was immediately clear that things were different. And so I used those photos to measure change in the size and the species that were caught over time, and found that there was a 90% loss of the size of these large fish over 50 years. So sort of a very visual example of the shifted baseline.
So hey everyone, my name's John Sutter. I'm an explorer with the National Geographic Society and a contributor for climate issues at CNN. And what I want to talk to you about today is a project that I sort of came up with and developed on a visiting fellowship here at Nieman, and it aims to address this issue that was raised in that short video clip, which is of shifting baseline syndrome. And this is something I started reading about a few years ago, and it honestly just really flipped me out, and I think it's one of the main reasons that we're not doing more about the climate crisis, is that we don't fully recognize how much the world is changing around us and underneath our feet. Here's sort of one definition: a phenomenon of lowered expectations in which each generation, so generational change, regards a progressively poorer natural world as normal. A fisheries scientist, Daniel Pauly, coined this term back in the 1990s, and I was definitely slow to catch on to this. I think the reason I'm so upset by that idea that we're missing the true magnitude of the climate crisis, or not really feeling it, is that I've spent a lot of time up really close to this problem in the last 10 years, mostly working with CNN. This is a photo from about this time last year in Honduras. It was a story about a fairly unprecedented drought that was happening in the dry corridor of Central America that was driving people into the caravan and north to the US. I think a lot of the big news stories have this climate component that is under-realized. This is from the Marshall Islands in 2015, which is of course a country in the Pacific that's very existence is threatened by sea level rise because the islands are so low-lying. This is from Puerto Rico. Maybe 4 or 5 months after Hurricane Maria, I spent about a year and a half going back and forth to Puerto Rico for CNN. I led the network's investigative work there, including on the undercounting of deaths following Hurricane Maria. So I'm very tuned to the intense human suffering that is associated with this big global phenomenon that's happening. And I started to get really worried about the ways in which human time, like the way that we process stories, is different from Earth time and climate time, which is happening, across our generational lines. And it's just painful for me to think that these stories would wash over us, one event after the next, and that we'd start to normalize some of the changes that are happening. Of course, as we've heard several times here, we have the data to know what's happening. This is Charles Keeling, who in the 1950s was sort of the first to start measuring the actual buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere and then attribute that to fossil fuels. And we know from charts like this from NASA or maps like this, what's happening both globally and locally in terms of temperature. The climate central resources are really great on this, but that's different from feeling it and knowing that something has changed, and from that being sustained over long periods of time and not getting stuck in this feeling of like everything just feels slightly abnormal compared to what it used to be. This is Fran Moore, who's at UC Davis, and she did something awesome in terms of thinking about like ways in which we process what's happening in the weather, which is that she looked at Twitter. And she wanted to know, what are people complaining about with regards to extreme heat? And is that an actual reflection of what's happening in the weather data? And essentially what she found is that we have like a 2 to 8 year memory when it comes to whether we decide today is hot or not. Like, is this an unusually hot day? Our memory is only 2 to 8 years long. And what she's postulating is that that memory shifts forward with time. So if you see the red line at the top being the actual like difference in temperature, the blue line is the way that we perceive it. And she's expecting, and a lot of other scientists are, that will just sort of shift forward in a flat way through time, and that we won't realize the magnitude of what's really happening. I think if you look at the way that we talk about this in the media, it's not especially encouraging. This is from 1988 when James Hansen famously testified before the US Senate saying the era of global warming had begun. This is from George Marshall's book, Don't Even Think About It. And he lists several examples of when environmental groups mostly raised the alarm and said, there are 10 years left to save the planet, 5,000 days to save the planet. And you see these moving forward through time, to the present with the same kind of deadlines attached. I've been guilty of this too before I'd read that book. This is a column I wrote for CNN in the lead up to the Paris climate talks, where I was saying 100 days left to save the world. And yet we know that emissions are still rising in 2018, another front page from the New York Times. So, despite the conversations that we're having, and I do think this is like a different moment in some ways in terms of the climate conversation, I'm interested in looking at the long haul of the way that we're processing these changes, or in some cases not. So that's depressing, but I want to talk about the ways in which I think storytelling and science can like at least try to address this, and that's what I was spending a lot of time, working on while I was here at Nieman. And one thing I did was spend time with researchers in the hard sciences that follow subjects over many years or decades. It's called longitudinal research. This is a guy, John O'Keefe at the Harvard Forest, who like 30 years ago, just almost on a whim, decided he wanted to start taking really detailed notes about the trees around him. And he had kind of like a particular path he liked to walk. And just sort of because he was like, I'm just gonna start making like regimented notes. When you do that for 30 years, you all of a sudden have what is like the best record of the way that climate has changed that forest. And he didn't anticipate the climate crisis. It just like happened during his like walking and note-taking. If you look at, he is like completely awesome. He used to be he was like a fighter pilot, and when he was like flying above, the land, he would find himself like thinking about the forest below, not about like engaging in like air combat. So I also looked to the arts. Like this is probably the most famous example of a longitudinal film. It's called the 7 Up series, or the Up series by Michael Apted. And he was 21 when he started this in the 1960s. I met him last weekend and was like completely starstruck. He's 77 now. And the subject of this film, they were 7-year-old kids at the beginning. They're now 63. And this is the trailer for 63 Up, which is the latest edition of this series, where he's followed up with these same kids every 7 years, over a span of many decades. And I show this partly because I think there's something like really emotional and nostalgic about watching someone age on film or in a visual medium. I think that it hits in a different way sort of the magnitude of a life that any one check-in might not really get at. And so, with his permission, after sort of doing some research here, I'm, launching a film series called Baseline that aims to be sort of an environmental version of the 7 Up series, checking in with 4 locations on the front lines of the climate crisis every 5 years until the year 2050. And I want to introduce you to briefly to just one of the locations, which is up near the Arctic Circle. I think like I'm taking like an explicitly like human look at this. Like there would be, other ways to measure changes in the landscape or to do this in a much more scientific way. Like I am taking what I've learned from the sciences in terms of looking at shots that can be replicated in ways to sort of, have data also exist alongside these human stories. But I'm really interested in like how we respond to the climate crisis and what we're seeing and not seeing about the world around us and the changes that are happening. So I want to introduce you just to one family from this community in Alaska, and then we can talk more about the rest of it later in the discussion.
Today is May 20, right? 22nd today?
I don't know.
May 22nd. If the time was still the same way, like this from long ago, they'll be driving snow goes in mountains and stuff like that. There's lots of snow yet, huh?
Mm-hmm.
They want to relocate, I don't know where, someplace across there, I think.
Yeah.
You okay? Across the lagoon, I don't know.
Huh?
Maybe we'll be gone by the time they relocate to town, huh?
Yeah.
There was lots of ground then that time.
Off the ground.
Yeah, lots of ground.
Hardly any ground now.
We're right on the edge now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is Shelton and Clara Kakiak. And I met them in 2009, like doing a story for CNN, and I've kept up with them over the years. And the reason I came back to their particular story, besides that I just really like love them as people, is that in this village there's a really like cool tradition that has to do with names. And when like a new child is born in Shishmaref, like traditionally that child is named after the most recent person who passed away. And they see it, depending on who you talk to, it's like almost some form of reincarnation, not in like the most literal sense, but in that the story of that person is carried, through time and across generational lines. And this is really personal for Shelton and Clara because their son, Norman, fell through the sea ice in 2007 and died on a hunting trip. And there are a couple kids in this village who are named Norman after him and who carry that story with them and know about the Norman that they're named for. And one of them is on the right here. And he is an 11-year-old kid who, loves hunting, like totally spunky, outdoor kind of kid. But when you ask him about his name and the story of his community, he says things like he's actually dreamed about drowning before, and he thinks that that's because he knows what happened to the person who he's named for. And he, like other people in this village, are really grappling with, will we exist here in the future? Like they've voted 3 times to relocate. Like the community's made that decision. They haven't figured out a way to do it or really the money to make that happen. So like some of the communities in this series, like this one, are caught in a sort of limbo and are trying to navigate a future that looks, very uncertain. I will say that what I'm trying to evoke with this series is a different kind of thinking about the future and about time. And my hope is that by following families like this and many others in places that are, some that where there's land disappearing and where people are moving out, but others that are still on the ascendancy and where people are moving in and they seem booming, even though there are a lot of problems related to the climate crisis. That by committing to follow those stories over a long period of time, I'm hoping that evokes a different kind of reaction and thinking about the future and the fact that real people are living into it. So here is like the website for the project. There's a newsletter you can sign up for. That's probably the best way to follow along. There's my email. I'd love to be in touch. Very much like looking for partners and all that on this. But I appreciate you taking time to listen to this and about the idea of shifting baselines.
You all see that? Let's make this. Are you guys all going to see my notes if I use them? Is that how it works? Sorry. All right, I'm just going to talk. So, a quick intro. Hold on. I would love my notes if I could have them, but you guys just see them, right?
We won't look at them. This far away, so not at all.
So, well, it's like, how do you, okay, well, that's embarrassing. So basically, this is so annoying. Woo! All right. So I cover natural disasters or unnatural disasters, or let's just say disasters that haven't happened yet. It's really fun. I get to lead with stuff like something really bad could happen sometime in the future. A lot of ifs, maybes, probablys, and then here are a bunch of numbers that sound terrifying, and then we have no solutions. Everyone in the newsroom calls me the princess of doom and gloom. But we know, everyone in this room, that this is a disaster that is happening. And the challenge is, how do we get more people to care? How do we convey urgency? How do we tell them it's now, not later? And for the last year, I've been focusing on the coast, and sea level rise here is the biggest challenge and the biggest issue for climate change. And it's hard in California to get people to think about it when the beach looks like this. It was 90 degrees last week and wonderful beach weather. But this is happening more and more often. And that's San Francisco, not Miami. And we took that photo this year. That is an entire row of homes hanging over the bluff in Pacifica. And it's really easy in California, and I know in your communities as well, to think of these as one-off events. You've all heard the term slow-moving disaster. It's really hard. You can't stand on the beach for one afternoon and really feel and see that the sea is rising in a really urgent kind of way. So some numbers, 9 feet of sea level rise by end of century is what the state is planning for as the high-end extreme. Economic damage is expected to be 10 times more than the state's worst wildfires and earthquakes to date by the end of the century from flooding. More than 2/3 of beaches in Southern California could be completely gone. And all of our salt marshes on the West Coast, this entire ecosystem could go extinct. Are you guys asleep yet? Because every time I wrote these numbers as a daily, a new study found, blah, 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 and we are all doomed, I feel like people kind of zoned out, or they were able to read it, freak out, and then move on. So, and I wasn't answering a really important question, what do we do about this? What does this mean? And I'm just gonna, so we regrouped, we reassessed. The LA Times has been doing these special sections this year, a bunch of them, and they've really been pretty remarkable in terms of impact. We are literally taking out an entire section of the newspaper and telling readers, hey, this is really important, think about this, and sea level rise is a crisis that's happening now, not later. I think someone told me once that they ordered 100 copies and distributed to every single lawmaker in Sacramento, which was really cool. And my coworker, Suzanne Russ, did a piece last week, also another special section on the Marshall Islands, basically there's this tomb of radioactive nuclear waste from the US from the Cold War, basically in the Marshall Islands, floating, it's corroded, no one's looked at it in decades, and the sea is rising, and no one is doing anything about it. So both pieces were, I think my project was 220 inches. Suzanne did kind of a bunch of sidebars as well, but they're completely standalone stories that really shook our readers, print and digital. So climate change in California is so interesting. Every single person I talked to on the coast about this issue was like, of course I believe in climate change. I drive a Prius. I recycle all the time. Yeah, the sea is rising. I see that. And I read all the studies. I'm very educated. But no, not my beach, not my home. I'm on this elevated thing, or it's a sand spit, and I've got at least another 100 years. Don't mess with my home values. Don't mess with my way of life. So the debate in California along the coast is very much about time. How much time do we really have? And I went to dozens of cities up and down the coast trying to find kind of these narrative threads and these universal themes and kind of really figuring out how to tell this story of what do we do. And every single city council meeting I went to was very charged, very controversial. Everyone was debating this existential crisis and question. And it really felt like every time I was sitting in these city council meetings and reading 900-page planning reports and talking to all these stakeholders that everyone felt like we had so many different options for adaptation. But then, I went back to the newsroom, looked at all my notebooks, and really were able to categorize these solutions and options into 3 different categories. So one is to defend in place. Seawalls are really popular, but they kill beaches and don't last forever. Another option is sand renourishment, which I think is very popular on the East Coast and is increasingly something that communities who can afford it really want as their option to keep their way of life for as long as possible. But the question of where does the sand come from, how much does it cost, and all those questions are kind of really weighing down those communities. And the third option is relocation, manage retreat, whatever word you want to use. That's challenging, particularly on the California coast, because our most expensive property is on the coast. I think I was at a retreat conference that John helped put together in June, and there was a number that New York spent $120 million buying out 300 homes on Staten Island after Sandy. $120 million dollars would buy out maybe 10 homes in Malibu. So different. So I just remember telling my editor, I was like, I feel like everyone I talk to thinks that sea level rise is a game that they can win. They're not doing anything because they're just waiting for the solution to drop into their lap. And then I was like, why not create a game? She's like, let's make a game. So we made a game. Let's play the ocean game we got. So basically, the sea rises 1 notch every turn. You are in charge of the town of anywhere coastal California. And you have 8 turns to basically not lose all your money, not lose the beach, and not lose the homes, which are the 3 kind of competing priorities. And then, so let's just start with, okay. Oh no, new flood maps show the sea could rise 3 feet in the next 30 years. Homeowners are begging you to build a rock wall to block the ocean, but enviros worry a man-made barrier would ruin the beach. Let's just add sand, because that's kind of, based on the data, the most popular one. So yay, everyone loves you. And we make the point that sand is popular, you get a beach for a year, but it's expensive and not sustainable. So congratulations, your economy is good, people love you, but the sea is still rising. Let's build a rock wall just to show you guys what a seawall looks like. It also costs money. Homeowners love you, the neighborhood council awards you mayor of the year, politically great. Okay, the sea rises another notch. Okay. The beach is getting smaller and more crowded. What do? Most people at this point add more sand because they didn't learn the first time. Costs more, and then we also automate, a storm is randomized every 20% to destroy your rock wall. So, oh no, massive winter storms destroy your wall. So here's your fun meter. You can either rebuild the wall. Let me just show you. Okay. And then, okay, 8 turns are up. You lost. Okay, so let's play again. Let me just show you. So the goal is, I feel like most people played at least twice, and the goal is that by the second time you play, you recognize that the only way to win against the sea is to cut your losses sooner. So let me just quickly show you this, and then we'll move on. So the hire a consultant, which no one ever does, gives you the tricks to start your managed retreat program now. And then I would encourage you guys to go on latimes.com/sea-level-rise and just play with this. This is our buyout kind of logic, and we really thought this one through, but that will take time. So let's go back to my presentation without my speaking notes. So how did we do this? Oh, actually, yeah, I did want to show you guys how we embedded it into the actual. So this was with the main bar, and you guys saw the story. It's 220 inches. We wrote a top that really kind of conveyed this theme, and we embedded it pretty much like right around the time we introduced this idea that you only have so many options, all of the choices suck, and all of them have consequences. And with photos and a really beautiful build, like this is something that really was effective with our readers. And in doing our research, when we were like, let's make a game, can we make a game? There are a lot of really cool news games out there. And one from ProPublica, the Financial Times, Bloomberg, the one with the cops, it was kind of our proof of concept. We had a very simple black and white one that someone in the newsroom did. It was really about finding the resources within our newsroom. My editor was like, we're not gonna be able to hire a programmer. We holed up in a conference room for a week and used so many sticky notes and mapped out the entire decision tree. So if someone picks a seawall, what does the next turn look like? What are the choices? What does the messaging say? Everyone thought we were crazy, but by the time we nailed it down into 8 turns, we started really shopping this idea around and pulling people into the conference room and pitching, hey, sit down, okay, what do you want to do? Build a seawall? Okay, go down this way, and then we just walk them through the decision tree. And we finally found a graphic designer, Swetha Kannan, and a engineer, like a computer scientist in our newsroom to help us really build out our vision. This is, if you look at the actual page, this is what we did for print readers. The graphic team actually made the decision tree a lot prettier. And we did 3 playing paths for our print readers, and they were able to follow it, and they learned the same lessons that the digital game was hoping to convey. I know that's not great, but you can see it in the paper. I love the culture of just the internet and programming and open source data. Like our programmers are sharing these ideas on GitHub, and the Financial Times inspired us with their Uber game, which was very much a choose your own adventure. There was no like allocated resources, and it was very much like, let's just pick which path you want to go on and we'll take you on an educational journey. And they tweeted after this, this is their 3rd news game, which was really cool, but they said they were inspired by our game to really start focusing on limited resources and strategizing kind of how much money you spend within a certain amount of turns. And I think what's really important with this game was that, it had to be informative, but it also had to be playable. So we were really thinking about the entertainment aspect of it. I mean, you guys got a kick out of the little cute Easter eggs throughout the game. And I think each of these news games did that effectively, and we really learned from that. Just a few more minutes left. I was really struck by the number of people who also said that they were the writing of this piece really resonated with them. And I just wanted to, I think because of what we've been talking about for the last 2 days, I created a few more slides. So we wrote about this issue in a way our readers had never seen before. We told it like it is. We just said the sea was rising. We didn't talk about how it rose, like why it's rising, whether it's rising. We just said it was, and then the 99% of the story was about what do you do about it. We went from macro to micro, and we just left no room for debate. And I think that was really effective without using the words climate change. Again, like conversational but authoritative, kind of really not letting you decide whether or not this is something you agree or disagree with. It's just a fact. Kind of playing with a little bit of the game theme. And this is the ending of our lead, and wording like, we refuse to confront the reality of the sea as it pushes deeper into our cities. There's an intimacy and urgency there. This is the ending, no kicker quote, no expert voice, completely just written, and the ocean always wins. That's the takeaway. I think I'm short on time, but we can talk about these. I mean, I think all the basics of reporting a really good story, finding your narrative threads. That was important for the written story as well as the game, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. And ultimately, I wasn't trying to get people to talk about climate change in this. The question that readers were left with as they read to the end was, what do you want your coast, the California coast, to look like? What do you care about? What do you want to preserve? And what are you willing to sacrifice or pay or change to do that? So on the left is Broad Beach in Malibu. That is the public staircase down to the beach during high tide because of the seawall. And on the right is Gleason Beach, where every time I go back, there's like one less home, and the highway, that's a really critical highway that connects that whole area to the Bay Area, is pretty much close, like falling off the cliff. And I had this quote, just in closing, taped up to my computer when I was writing and reporting this project. In the end, we will conserve only what we love will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. And I think everyone in this room is responsible for teaching that understanding. And that's it. LAtimes.com/sea level rise is where you'll find the project and the game. LAtimes.com/environment is where you'll find the rest of our team's coverage. I feel like we have a pretty kick-ass team on the West Coast, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
These guys had good PowerPoints. I don't know how to make PowerPoints, so sorry in advance. My name's Emily Atkin. That's like not a good starting slide, so whatever. I told you I was not good at this. How do I do this?
Show us the newsletter.
Show us the newsletter. How do I make it big? And then I press what guy to do the next? That guy? Okay, wait. Oh my God, wait, no, it's on a timer. No! I'm the same problem you had.
What's that?
Please help me. Okay, all right. All right, that's fine. Okay. Okay, my name is Emily Atkin. I write a climate change newsletter called Heated. I have been a journalist for my whole career, and I sort of just wanted to start by having everyone think about why they're in journalism and what inspired you to become a journalist and the purpose of the job and sort of what brought you here. I know for me, I took a journalism class my first semester, my sophomore year of college, and I took it because I thought it was a class about how to keep a journal, like, because I always loved keeping a journal. And legitimately, like, I guess my high school did not teach me what journalism was. And so I was like looking for a major, and I was like, okay. And then I had this older, curmudgeonly dude from Staten Island as my journalism 1 teacher, and obviously it wasn't that. And he'd spent his whole life reporting for the Staten Island Advance, and he just, on the first day of class, he did this diatribe that was just like, the First Amendment is the most important pillar to democracy, and the journalist is, is the person who, there's freedom of the press, and the press is the person who helps create an informed citizenry that is able to respond to society's most complex problems. And without a free press, democracy crumbles. And I was like, oh man, this is so much better than keeping a journal. And I was just, that was it, right? Like, I never looked back. I never did anything else after that day. I was like, there's no other way to do that, to do a job, like, this is it. And so I loved that. And so I moved to New York, and I did all these journalism internships, and I became the research assistant for this journalist whose name was Wayne Barrett. And he was this legendary investigative journalist. He wrote for the Village Voice. I didn't know you wrote for the Voice. Did you know Wayne? Yeah. Wayne was the most badass journalist ever. And he was, the way I always talk about him is that he was pissed off all of the time. Because Wayne saw in New York City injustice all around him. He saw the city's non-white majority being pillared and plundered by rich power brokers. And he considered it, he was pissed off about that, and he considered it his mission to expose that game, to expose how the rich and powerful were taking advantage of the needy, of the vulnerable. And that was so invigorating to me because that went back to what I always wanted to do, seek truth and report it, speak truth to power, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And, you know, so I did that internship. It was unpaid. That was his one flaw. And I went and I started, you know, in journalism, and I became a climate change journalist. I took my first job, like big job in DC. I was like legal reporter at first, and I took this big job in DC to be a climate reporter. And it was for this like liberal-leaning publication, Think Progress, RIP. And, but, you know, the promise was that you just reported on climate change, right? And there was you didn't have to have a political stance on it. You just reported on climate change. I didn't know much about it, but I was like, okay, sure. And I always, at Think Progress, always went down the middle about the science. I spent the first year sort of just reading scientific studies and then calling other scientists and being, because there was all this like climate denial, and I was like, well, I got to make sure that that's not true, right? So I spent all this time and being like, oh man, it's not true. So and then in my reporting, I'd be like, climate change is real, blah, blah, blah. And I would get called like an activist and a Democrat and all this stuff. And I'd be like, okay, that's super weird. And then, you know, Inside Climate News came out with that story about how Exxon had information, you know, spanning back 30 years, the year I was born, 1989, about how bad climate change was, and then instead of making that public and doing something about it, funded $1 billion disinformation campaign to get other people to cast doubt on the science. And then, you know, other oil industry players went in and joined suit, and then Republican politicians joined suit as well. And basically, the reason I was getting called the Democrat for stating the facts about science, doing the journalism that I've been trained to do all these years, was because of this disinformation campaign. And I was like, oh, well, look at that. That was crazy. And so that's always been really crazy to me, how, you know, that has really hindered our profession. And so the next 6 years, I've been a climate journalist now for 6 years, been trying to focus my journalism on that for so long, but I have not been able to. I went over to Sinclair Broadcast Group after that, which is a sort of conservative-leaning TV station network. And after that, went to the New Republic, and nowhere was I really able to put that into focus. That's why this is the first slide, by the way, because I'm like, deception. Scientists at major fossil fuel companies, you know what I'm saying. So I was never able to find a place where I was able to report on this all the time. And so that's why we have this. Heated is my newsletter. I launched it. I left the New Republic to start it 2.5 months ago. It's a daily Monday through Thursday newsletter focused on accountability journalism about the climate crisis. It every day ranges in topics, but it's Monday through Thursday, probably anywhere from 800 to 1,200 words, one subject a day, one story a day. And it's whatever I feel like. And it's, you know, a reader emailed me recently to say that he considered it a modern form of gonzo journalism, because what I do in Heated is I put myself into the story a lot. Gonzo journalism is not actually, a lot of people associate it with Hunter S. Thompson, so like drug-fueled crazes. That's not what I do. But I looked it up, and it was like, you know, a form of new journalism where the journalist is the protagonist. The journalist is ultra transparent about their reporting technique, about their subjective opinions, and that's basically the deal. So, how do I do that? I wanted to give one example. So this is something I wrote a couple days before my 30th birthday. Sort of come off and say, like, you know, next Monday is Indigenous Peoples Day. To honor it, we're going to do a whole week of Indigenous climate stories. but Monday is my 30th birthday, so I want to talk about the year I was born, 1989. And so I don't have it on here. I should have put it on, but there's a big baby picture of me. So it starts out with this big old baby picture of me. And then I say, like, that same year when I was growing in my mom's belly, scientists and experts made some pretty alarming predictions about what was then widely known as the greenhouse effect. So I list a bunch of reports, scientific reports that happened in 1989, and like really alarming things that the EPA said, California Energy Commission said, and then what George H.W. Bush's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State said, which is if the climate change within the range of current predictions actually occurs, the consequences for every nation and every aspect of human activity will be profound. That's George H.W. Bush's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in 1989, the year I was born, literally growing in my mother's belly. I know that babies don't grow in bellies. So how Republicans reacted the year I was born. So I spoke with Kevin Kirchner, who he was working for New Jersey's Republican Governor Tom Keene. Now he's involved with climate liability lawsuits against the fossil fuel industry. He basically told me that like Republicans were in the vanguard of climate action in 1989, and they were like on the forefront of doing something about it. There were market action bills, all this stuff. But then also in 1989, that is when the nation's leading oil and automobile companies led by ExxonMobil created a group called the Global Climate Coalition, which was devoted to preventing regulations on greenhouse gas emissions. This group was created despite years of documentation by Exxon's own scientists that the products they sold, fossil fuels, had the potential to cause catastrophic climate change, as Inside Climate reported in their Pulitzer Prize nominated series, blah, blah, blah. You know the deal, right? So now, 30 years later, I'm flying on an airplane. I'm about to fly on an airplane to Denver, Colorado. And I'm really scared to tell my readers about this because I know if I say I'm flying on a plane, they'll be like, well, we have to stop. You know, like you have to stop flying on planes because of climate change. But at the same time, I'm like, I didn't do this, you know? And that's the message that I try to give to my readers is that we center so much of our conversation on us, on what I can do to solve the climate crisis. When in reality, the reason that the reason that this is happening is because a few rich and powerful humans, wire pullers, profiteers, decided that they wanted to do everything they possibly could to gain short-term profit and not have us do this. So I flew to Colorado on a goddamn airplane because I think the only way we solve a problem caused by widespread lying is to make the truth louder. And so I wanted to go to the SEJ conference and talk about the fossil fuel industry's disinformation campaign. Anyway, and then because I wanted to eat cake with my family. So that's me eating cake. I put these in the newsletter. So it's not the only thing that I do. I like to use my personal, my sort of personal experiences to create a bond with my readership so that they get to know me, so that they trust me. And so, you know, there's this, right? But it's not all, I don't just like do every single issue about the fossil fuel industry. Like, so these are the bags that come in Prime Now orders. And I was always like, what do I do with these? I have no idea what to do with these things. So I decided to do an investigation on whether or not they were recyclable, how to do all these things. And I go step by step in the article to show if these are recyclable. They turn out they're not, right? Because they're made of mixed-use plastics. And I consulted a recycling expert, just like absolutely not, all that kind of stuff. Then we did a follow-up about how these kinds of things contribute to global warming, right? Because there's a study that says that the way Americans produce, procure, deliver, and dispose of goods accounted for nearly half of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions. The most damaging part of that process, of like our consumer process, is not how we use the stuff. It's the way companies transport our stuff, or it's not the way companies transport our stuff. It is the way manufacturers make our stuff. So The issue is not that Amazon's freezer bags are non-recyclable, it's that they're not made of recycled material. So by relying on freezer bags made of non-recycled material, Amazon is increasing demand for extraction, right? So it's not really the problem. You can say, oh, I don't want to get these bags in my order, but as long as Amazon is still creating demand for the product, we're still extracting materials out of the earth. That's the core of the problem. So another thing, that's not the only thing that I do either, and I'm not always in my story. Sometimes, we'll just look at how fossil fuel companies are trying to keep, the narrative going about climate change, about how they're not the issue to climate change, that they're with us in the fight against climate change, right? So I looked at ExxonMobil's ads on Twitter. Here I saw that, so Twitter is they announced a ban on political ads, right? And that means that anybody that has an issue about a political issue would be banned from advertising on Twitter. But these were not characterized as issue ads by Twitter. So ExxonMobil's ads that said, how do industrial plants lower CO2 emissions? We're finding ways to help capture them. Even tweets about the lawsuits against it by the New York Attorney General were not marked as political by Twitter. But tweets by environmental groups saying we should solve climate change were marked as political. So under this new ad ban, this investigation revealed, Exxon's tweets would not be banned, but environmental groups would. So what happened after that was actually kind of crazy, because one thing that I was scared of when I left mainstream publication was whether or not I would be able to make an impact now that I didn't have the support of, the New Republic or Sinclair or some big institution. But I found that wasn't really a problem because of this. So Elizabeth Warren's team apparently saw it, said, Twitter's new ad policy will allow fossil fuel companies to buy ads defending themselves and spreading misleading info, but won't allow organizations fighting the climate crisis to buy ads, holding those companies accountable. We need accountability. Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, responded, said, we haven't announced the new ad rules yet. They come out on the 15th, taking this all into consideration. After that, the investigation was picked up by The Guardian, Washington Post, Axios, all these places. 22 pro-environment organizations call on Twitter to allow climate change ads. Yesterday, Twitter backtracks on banning ads for social and political issues. CBS News cites my reporting as one of the reasons why. And I didn't tell anybody to do anything, It just this whole thing completely reinstituted what I learned in journalism school, which was that if you have faith in an informed public to make decisions, you don't need to tell people what to do. You just need to give them the right information. There's been so much talk at this conference about how do we get people engaged? How do we get people to really care about the climate crisis? And we say things like, we should use words differently, like we should use climate change instead of climate crisis, or we should appeal to a broader range of people. I honestly think that you just need to give them more information about the accountability part of this story, about the corruption level, about the fossil fuel and how the fossil industry tries to manipulate people to not think that they are the problem that caused this. And then people get fired up because that's a corruption story. I mean, there's a reason why every time you turn on the news today, there's a story about the impeachment inquiry. It's because the impeachment inquiry is a corruption story, and the public loves a good corruption story. And that's what climate change is, for the most part. So one thing I do is I don't tell anybody what to do. I don't tell them how to take action against the climate crisis. I don't think that's my job as a reporter. I want to give people information and then they can do what they want. But then I get all these emails from people that are like, but I don't know what to do. And I'm like, okay, fine. So I did this section called Hot Action, which is where readers suggest actions individuals can take to help solve the climate crisis. I just let them talk in it. So this one was about taking coal out of your electric bill using Acadia Action. We also have an editorial, I say we, it's just me. We also have an editorial memist, which is like my version of an editorial cartoonist, because memes are sort of like the modern version of editorial cartooning. This was about Murray Energy declaring bankruptcy after spending, millions of dollars supporting Trump's reelection. I partnered with Climeme Change, which is just a popular Instagram account that makes memes, and he just sends me stuff, and I put them in the newsletter. That was after I spoke with a reporter who had worked on this year-long investigation into Texas coal companies. That's Oprah saying, you get contaminated water and soil, and you get contaminated water and soil. Anyway, so, before I go to that, we'll just leave that up there. So, I have my ideas on why I think that this works, but I really wanted to just ask the readers. We have 15,000 readers in just a little over 2 months, 15,000 subscribers. And so on Thursday before I came here, I asked them to tell me why they like the newsletter, if they like it, or why they don't. If they don't. And what they told me is, so I got 111 responses. 109 people said they liked the newsletter. 2 people said they did not. 1 person said they didn't like it because it was too America-focused. 1 person said that they were afraid that my divisive language would be more divisive. Of those 109 people, 84 respondents, or 77%, cited the tone. They said that, having somebody who felt as pissed off about this crisis as them made them feel like, made them feel heard. 68 respondents, or 62%, cited the focus of the content. 34% cited the format, so getting it in your inbox every single day. 6 respondents cited action items. 4 respondents cited memes. 4 respondents cited bananas and drinking water. I tell my readers that they should eat bananas and drink water because you should. Another observation is the theme of community. Out of 109 positive responses, 6 people said the newsletter's personal tone of anger made them feel less alone. Many said that it inspired confidence to talk to other people about climate change. So just like learning about the fossil fuel industry, about freight rail industry, about just like how manipulation occurs, made them actually want to talk to other people about climate change. It made them feel less depressed and guilty. A lot of words like authentic, real, trust, friend. These are some of my favorite ones. You make the end of the world fun was my favorite one. I never thought of climate change as a corruption issue, now I do. So much climate reporting is stuck in this paradigm of prizing objectivity and neutrality, which seems to reflect an acceptance of facets of the status quo. Like that meaningful climate action is politically impossible. Heated makes me feel like I'm not alone in being furious and ready for change. The main thing I come back to is that it's solid journalism. It's informed climate reporting geared to an audience that wants it. Other outlets may be either too detached to turn out perfunctory stories or have to cater audiences that may be less interested in ending up both sides of the issue. So I have to wrap up, but one of the main things that I wanted to touch on is basically, I'm gonna pull this up because I don't wanna mess it up. But is that, so this whole time that I've been here, I mean, like I'm actually just gonna read this so I don't mess it up because I wanna talk about how I generally come to be perceived. One of the reasons I got asked to come here was because of the newsletter, and I was asked to explain why I do more of an activist approach. And I mentioned this, but I've been called an activist for reporting on climate change for the last 6 years. But the only thing that I'm an advocate for is my profession, is for journalism, and for journalists to do what we're supposed to do, which is to serve democracy by reporting the facts, speaking truth to power, and most importantly, creating an informed citizenry. The truth is that the fossil fuel industry and its coordinated denial campaign has made it so that journalists, healthcare practitioners, society's biggest decision makers feel uncomfortable talking about climate change. We heard that here. And even more uncomfortable being angry about climate change. And that is exactly what the fossil fuel industry wanted. They wanted us to stop talking about it, to be uncomfortable talking about it, so that they could continue to make profits and so that they would have to ramp down, they wouldn't have to ramp down production. They duped us. And so it's our jobs not to be duped anymore. The good news is that corruption is the sexiest journalism story in the world. People like it. You know, you might be worried about how that'll come off with conservative readers, but I would argue that it's not your job to handhold your readers. Everyone here has been so not everyone, obviously, but you know, this whole time I feel like everyone's been so focused on making climate journalism for people who don't want it. But yet we haven't figured out how to make good climate journalism for people who do want it. We assume that educating people who are already interested in climate change is just preaching to the choir, but that's not true. Most people who are interested in climate change just don't have the tools to talk about it confidently yet. The choir is there and they want to sing, but they don't know the words to the songs. And it's our job to teach them the words. It's our job to create an informed citizenry, and I don't really care how you do it. You don't have to be like me. I think that what you guys showed is just some of the most impressive stuff I've ever seen, and I'm so excited for our profession to have creative ways to tell stories and do journalism. I believe in the power of journalism. I want us to live up to this great responsibility, and I want us to be human beings. And I'll just end it on this quote from Wayne, which is that our credo must be the exposure of the plunderers, the steerers, the wire pullers, the bosses, the brokers, and the campaign givers and takers. So I say stew, percolate, pester, track, burrow, besiege, confront, damage, level, care. That's it.
Thank you both so much. I think that was incredibly inspiring. And like the theme of our, sort of our panel is one, like a little bit of a show and tell, and then also a discussion about how to get audiences' attention, whether they're like sort of woke to the climate crisis or whether they, don't want to pay attention to that yet. I just want to follow up on the point about activism, because that's something that I've thought a lot about too. Like I was a columnist for a while at CNN, and my work was labeled as opinion. It was always reported, and so sometimes that bothered me. But there is this tradition of journalists who report on the climate crisis, like Bill McKibben is one, who make a very deliberate switch into activism and advocacy. You said that you get labeled as that sometimes, and I'm wondering where you think that drive to have that label comes from, like why people are attaching that, and why you feel uncomfortable, as do I, like fully jumping into that camp, even if you're telling these stories in a very sort of personal and forceful way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between being an openly progressive journalist who expresses their opinion and being an activist, right? An activist is somebody who has prescribed solutions for a crisis and wants to get other people to do that solution. The only thing like I said, the only thing I'm activist for is journalism, number one, and number two, like to not die. I guess. I mean, like the same way, is somebody who reports on the opioid crisis, are they an activist because they don't want people to overdose from heroin? Right. Is somebody who reports, on the war effort, like an activist because they just don't want to see they don't want to see a bunch of people die in like nuclear war? We have a responsibility as journalists to at least have like some sort of moral clarity, right? That's actually our job, is to have moral clarity for our readers and to say like, when stuff gets really bad, we have to say, we have a responsibility to say this is bad. The climate crisis is a crisis. That's why the whole discussion made me so frustrated the first day about like, should we use the word crisis? Because I'm sitting here just like, but it is a crisis. You see the science? We're journalists. Our responsibility is not to handhold our readers. We do them a disservice when we do that. So, I'm not an activist.
And I think there's a difference between being authoritative and being an activist. And I think that's something that I've seen our environment team really take control over. And especially as we talk about it with multiple editors, especially for projects. And with the Sea Level Rise project, I think it really blew people away outside the newsroom and internally, because if you read the piece, I think I got away with 45 inches, which is like the average length of an entire feature-length story in the LA Times, with no attributions. And I didn't make that stuff up. It was all reported. My fact-checking was so stressful leading up to it. But, by removing that giving the reader the he said, she said, or some scientists say this, but other scientists say that. Just report that extra level of, do your homework and then say it the way it's supposed to be said and say it like it is. And then it removes the uncertainty. It tells the readers what to think about versus what to argue about. And I think that way we were able to really focus the story on solutions and adaptation options and not prescribing a solution, but really allowing people to understand the problem, move on, and really think about the choices.
I think that's a good point about authority, and sometimes people take authority as, sometimes that gets questioned, and I think the best reporting has enough source material that you can just say what is true. And I also think, with your newsletter, one of the reasons I find it really powerful is that it has a clear tour guide, and I think that sometimes for stories as big and complicated and messy as the climate crisis, even if, in some ways it actually is very simple, like we're polluting the atmosphere, making the world hotter, and that's causing, it to be more dangerous for us. That having someone sort of like take you through that in a personal way really is effective. Rosanna, you were telling me yesterday that with your piece was like 10,000 words, right? About the
Almost 10,000, yeah.
And that you only used the term climate change, what was it, once?
I think only once, and that was a afterthought because we felt like we had to put it in the top 5 paragraphs.
So tell me about that, how that came about, and whether it sounds like it was very intentional.
Yeah, and I think, we talk about this a lot within the environment desk. I think climate change, and we've talked about this a lot at the conference, is kind of a vague word in itself, and our climate team is structured so that I cover coast and oceans. We have an air quality reporter, a freshwater reporter, a wildfire reporter, a public lands, high desert reporter, an investigative reporter. But within each of our worlds, we think about how climate change pertains to our world. So I don't think about climate change, I think about sea level rise. Tony, who covers air quality, thinks about emissions and particulates. And so I think we get really more specific, and we have a joke in our newsroom that we never get the word nondescript into the paper because when something's nondescript, you got to describe it better. And I think with climate change, that word in itself, especially for our readership in California, we need to get a lot more specific. So this was a story about sea level rise and all the questions pertaining to it, and just following the traditional methods of good journalism and good reporting, we were able to explain all of that without really just spelling it out.
I mean, I think that all of us in different ways we're showing hard truths. Like I think you explicitly framed some of your headlines and stories in that way. Like we're in a situation that isn't good, that we put ourselves in, or the fossil fuel companies put us in. And I'm wondering how you all think about like the side of connecting with your audience in terms of like making sure the work either has impact or like influence, like in your community or in a specific place. Like how do you make sure that it gets paid forward and does something good, hopefully, out in the world, as opposed to just sort of landing and then making people freaked out?
So the most remarkable thing, I think I need to double check this with my editor, but I think the Sea Level Rise project is still the most successful enterprise project for our paper this year in terms of new subscribers for an enterprise piece. And we really we're really conscious about not just writing climate change stories to people who already believe it exists, which is most of California at this point. And I think what really stood out to me about this story was I really strove to challenge stereotypes. Like I didn't go to Malibu. I did go to Malibu and talk to people, but I didn't quote the rich homeowner with the $30 million house who just wants their private beach, even because that's the trope that you would lean into. I went to the poorest coastal community in California. I spent so much time finding the homeowner who spent her whole life saving money for her dream home on the beach. She ended up buying the ugliest house on the prettiest street in her town at the recession, and then within a year found out the town was thinking about managed retreat. This house might be underwater. She can't get flood insurance. And like when those characters are more relatable to you, you start thinking about how do I help her? Like that's not fair. Like how do we make this work for everyone while also confronting the fact that her house will be underwater in 10 to 20 years, and it is a problem. And I think finding these memorable characters and bringing people out of their corners rather than reinforcing these silos is really important. And rather than everyone in the story telling me the day after the story runs that they hated it or that they thought it was not right, they all told me that they felt heard. And I think we need to do more of that, like bringing people out of their corners and really seeing what the other people are saying.
What about you, Emily? I was really struck by what you said about people feeling less alone. Is that the way that they described it, by being part of that community?
Yeah, and I think that it speaks to like I said at the end, I think it speaks to the idea that we maybe make an assumption sometimes that people who care about climate change are already served by the news. But actually what I've found is that a lot of them don't feel served by the news, and that they still feel alone. They feel like the media environment doesn't get them. They don't know where to go to learn more. They don't feel confident about being able to talk about climate change at their kitchen table with their relatives, even though we know that that's the best way to drive action from reporting, is to have people talk about it, is to have people feel like that they can engage, right? And so I think that it just makes people feel less alone. One theme that I got was because I explicitly get really pissed off about stuff, and I'm just like, oh my God, like, can you believe how much money that has been spent to make us think stuff that isn't true? Because that does piss me off, because I'm a journalist, and I'm just like, I hate when people pay a bunch of money to lie to me. And so they're like, yeah, it is messed up. And then it's just like you have this sort of community feeling. And one of the reasons I explicitly tap into anger is because it is such a catalyzing emotion. Unlike, we talk a lot about gloom and doom stories versus solution stories. But like gloom and doom is like depressing and like, oh, awful. Like there's nothing we can do. Anger is like, oh, there is something we can do. We can stop these people lying to us. And then it's, depressed people never do anything. But angry people do everything. And so I think, it's a careful emotion to play with and to tap into, because you have to make sure that your anger is also matched with knowledge and compassion, right? Like there's a quote from my mentor's mentor that it's anger improves lucidity, knowledge, persistence, and memory. But the quote also explains that if it lacks knowledge, then it just comes off as petty, and if it lacks compassion, it risks coming off as like mean and awful and toxic, right? So you have to keep having those things. Your anger basically has to be on behalf of other people. It has to be just, it has to be righteous. And so I do that knowingly. Yeah.
Well, I love both of your projects, and I really appreciate you all, sharing them with everyone here. I want to open it up so we have a lot of time to have a conversation. Like if you all have, maybe we can start with some questions for any of us, and then I'd love it if you all have examples from your own work or things that you've seen that really helped grab attention on the subject of the climate crisis, or just anything else you wanted to share. We can have kind of a back and forth. Yeah.
Rosanna, it sounds like a silly question, but
No, it's
I want to know about the impact of a paper, actually newspaper in paper. Your stories, I checked two that you shared here, and since I guess many of us are very digital or TV, I want to know what is the impact of the paper version of your stories.
I think our paper and digital audiences have some overlap, but there are different audiences. I mean, we really kept the print reader in mind with the design of the video game, and I want to say the video game was it was very internet friendly as well. It was interesting to see how much the photo of the print special section went viral online and made people read the digital version, because again, that print statement that the LA Times took out a special section in the newspaper on a climate change story was pretty huge. So I think it drove a lot of digital traffic, and the video game was shareable. And then the print copy, it was, someone texted me in Sacramento, our state capital, and said, literally someone bought 100 copies and flew it up to Sacramento, or somehow got it up to Sacramento and distributed it to every single lawmaker. And that really has made a lot of noise politically. And there is this really cool movement of, political conversations at the state level now on this issue.
Susanna, I had a chance to read Susanna's piece too, since I talked to you about it, and I'm going to take a look at the sea level rise piece, because I didn't see it up in the San Francisco area. But I wanted to ask about it. So the paper gave such prominence to the story. I mean, it was a decision that they were going to focus on it in a big way. How was that achieved? How did that? What was the genesis of that? Did you take it to an editor? I mean, how did you make it happen?
So, I mean, I ended up going to like 6 or 7 towns in this one story, but it could have been easily 6 or 7 dailies with the same nut graph, but in a different place if we did that, normal drumbeat reporting approach. So at some point, my editor and I decided to hit pause and really think about what the bigger story was and how we were going to thread it together from a statewide level and make it a bigger story. With I'm sure you guys have all kind of dabbled in projects or worked on something where the conversation at some point is always, is this 3 stories or is it one really long story and how short can we make it? And I think we've really reached that point where 3 stories, like you really look at the digital readership and it drops off after the second story. Like the day 1 story is great and day 2 is kind of great and then day 3 is like no one really reads the epilogue. And we made the decision ahead of time to do it as one gigantic story. And then it was just me and my direct line editor was like, how many words can we get away with? And by the time it reached, all of the editors that have to read it at the projects level, it was just so airtight. And we had the game, we had this whole package that it was going to take up the entire A section. So the page designer was like, let's just do a special section. Like the photos are bomb. We have this whole page spread on the game. We have a 220-inch story. And it just came together. And since then, like you saw the Marshall Islands project, it looks really cool. Like the LA Times has been doing these takeouts a lot more and being more, there is like a process, but this one was really organic. And I think it really was, we found a great team internally. I had a great line editor who had a vision for this. When I said, let's make a video game, he was like, yeah, instead of, but we did have to kind of search within our newsroom to find the right people who were on board. And once we had a final product, it was like, obviously going to be a package.
Can you talk about the photo that you used to convince your editor?
Oh yeah, I was telling John last night, it's because the baseline concept is super fascinating too. And we do have a lot of beach, there's a lot of sand renourishment projects in California, but when I was starting to talk about sea level rise, I looked through our archives and found this photo of a beach in Malibu from like 1960 something, and it was so wide compared to like the beach when I went to it that past weekend, and just showing a vintage photo was so powerful and really made people see the change. And I think that's so powerful with what you're doing now, because we do renormalize things as we forget.
I think about the 10-year challenge social media thing on like Instagram where people are like, this was me 10 years ago and this is me now. And it's just like, ooh, you could make it dark real quick. No, but that's also why it's so powerful, is because like that's something we do all the time in our daily lives, is be like, wow, look at how much this is, like me and my loved ones have changed over time. It's like, your loved one can be a beach, it could be a tree, it could be all these other things, so.
Thank you. No, and I think like that's applicable in lots of ways. I was excited when you told me that you used an archival photo to try to make that
I loved
argument,
what you did
it's
with
like,
yours.
I think any ways that we can reach across time, either further forward into the future and make that feel real, and looking back into the past and showing how much things have already changed. Like there's a lot of archival material that'll be in the first version of this film, in part to show that we're not starting at like baseline normal. Like if I had been born in like the 60s or 70s and had this idea, it would have been better to start then. A lot has already changed, but there a lot of times there is material that can show you what
But and that's also why I did the baby pictures thing. I wish I included the picture of my actual like baby face, so I could be like, this is like the year. When you say like they knew for the last 30 years, right? Like what does that mean? I was like, well, my readers know me already, and I'm like, here's what I looked like, and it was just my infant face, right? And I got a lot of positive response from that, because I think it's just like you can tell people like this has been going on for 30 years. What does 30 years mean? Like I think you showed pretty well that like the perception of time, we get all wonky about it and weird. So you got to have something. I think visual is really important when talking about time.
That shot, I think the number of people who emailed me after the project ran saying they gasped out loud when they saw the drone shot of the opening, the special section with the train basically almost on the cliff. That's that feeling I got in your trailer, when you pan out on the drone with the houses literally on the edge. Like that visual, like this idea that we're living on the edge, it's such a powerful concept.
We looked at each other and we were like,
yeah, I got goosebumps thinking about it, yeah.
I'm just thinking about the shifting baseline. Have you or has anyone done an open source version of that? It feels like any community could tell the story of the shifting baseline in their community, and it could be sort of Is that
I'd
happening?
like to build it into a network. I'm developing a series of storytelling workshops in each community to sort of turn the camera around and have young people in each place tell their version of the story and like whatever story they want to tell, not like whatever I'm coming in and seeing. I thought about that, like if, I think it could grow into something like that. That would actually be like a dream come true. I picked 4 communities that I think show different aspects of what's happening with the climate crisis and where people are reacting very differently. So there is one community that is very heavily fossil fuel dominated in terms of the economy and where people just aren't seeing the reality in front of them in some ways or responding to it in ways that I think are interesting and surprising and will be relatable to people in lots of different places. Like I mentioned, a place that's booming as opposed to those that are, where there's a decline. But yeah, I would love to talk and think more about that. I think it could become a distributed model with the film at the center.
Emily, how's the newsletter funded? What are the economics of doing?
Great question. So the newsletter is published on Substack, which is sort of like the platform that journalists are publishing their newsletters on now. Substack, you can do a free newsletter or you can do a paid subscription newsletter. Substack, sort of just the way that a book publisher would give you an advance. Substack gave me an advance to do a free publication for 3 months to build a readership. And then once December 9th will be my 3-month mark, I'll put up a paywall for 75% of the content. People who like it can pay whatever rate I set. I haven't decided on it yet, but it won't be very high. And then they get full access to the content. They'll also get access to I'm developing sort of a place where all the paid subscribers can talk to each other. So that they can sort of have that more community feel, so that like you can move the hot action part like to a community place where they can actually talk about individual actions and I don't have to be like part of it. But like I'll come in and talk sometimes. But again, and that will help build trust with the community and sort of have it be not just a one-way street where I'm throwing quotes into a weird void and hoping that they land with people. So it is not funded by readers yet. We'll see how it goes on December 9th. You expect normally a 6 to 10% conversion rate from your free to your paid list on your first day, according to others. So it's sort of it's an experiment and it's a risk. And so I'll be super interested and slightly anxious to see how it goes.
Can you talk a little bit more about your work at CNN and it's sort of in terms of visuals for broadcast, for television, that kind of thing, and what visuals readers kind of tune out and what they tend to respond to? I mean, you've touched on it with the photos over time and things like that, but ways of kind of thinking about illustrating these stories visually.
Yeah, I thought the point earlier about the climate crisis is these human things and not necessarily these environment-related things. Like I think it's more about, to me, it's like what is going to grab someone or arrest them visually, and sometimes that's like an element of surprise, like, oh, I didn't realize that climate change looked like that. And I think that polar bears had their moment in terms of having that surprise factor, and now people feel like about it, even if it's like actually still really important. So at CNN, I tried to do a lot of, in terms of my own work, I ran a series that was called 2 Degrees in the year leading up to the Paris climate talks, and it was explicitly an open conversation with our audience. Like all of the stories were based on questions that people sent in through a Google form. And then we put those into groups of themes, what does the world look like past the 2 degree mark? How do we stop the world from getting to 2 degrees? And we had Facebook polls, and we asked people to vote those up and down, and I would just go out and do the story that got the top number of votes. That's how I ended up in the Marshall Islands. Is a woman in California wrote in with a question about climate displacement and refugees, and that story happened because of her and because of the Facebook poll. I think the visuals were I think you have to try to get really close and also zoom back really far. So with the Marshall Island story at the top of the page online, you know, we had an aerial of an island and then sort of faded it out and left a dotted line where it was before, and the headline was "You're making this island disappear," which was a provocation that, like, you know, our society is causing these massive changes to unfold.
I remember that one.
So it was
caused a stir.
So I was trying very much to speak, also in first person, like directly to an audience, and to be slightly more provocative. I will say that, like, the reaction to a series I did after that was called Vanishing, that was on the extinction crisis and the relation between extinction and climate, really outraged a lot of readers and got a lot of attention, and it was very non-human in its entire framing. There was one community in Madagascar that it was like a fishing community that was entirely dependent on a coral reef and its health for their own survival. And the reef health was obviously suffering related to climate. So I'm not all the way on board on, like, people won't care about just the natural world for its own sake, but I think you have to think of, like, how do you get really close to this and really personal and, like, really understand someone's life and the way in which this is playing out for them, or really zoom back and try to show, like, this magnitude of, you know, seeing the rail line, you know, right along the edge of the coast, and thinking in those metaphors too of, like, we're close to the edge. Like, I think that people respond well to trying to put things together for themselves and not just be, you know, told something, like, so explicitly. So with this film especially, it's very much trying to lead you to see the ways in which we're missing the big story by looking at it in just the now context, as opposed to just, like, you know, spelling that out all right away.
Perspective is also so important, and we tell such great stories from the community, I think, and your characters are so relatable too, and just you want to help them. And I think one thing that we noticed with the game that was missing was the decision-making aspect, right? So we gave readers the chance to be the mayor of the town and understanding, because I hear from so many, like, policy, because we vilify, obviously, industry, but also our leaders. And I think in California, there are a lot of really, 2 mayors I talked to lost their jobs over trying to do a smart managed retreat plan ahead of their time. And I thought it was just really interesting to hear all of them talk about the funding challenges, how they're dealing with homelessness and people wanting a wider sidewalk and all that stuff, and competing balance challenges and stuff like that. And then all the stakeholders were yelling at them at meetings. And I watched this happen for a year. And I think putting your shoes, I think it was also humanizing that element, and then allowing readers and just the general public to understand that these decisions are hard, not just from your perspective, but from the guy or the woman or the person who's just running the town. And that really was effective in a lot of ways that were surprising, but also rewarding.
And, like, to build on that too, like, these human stories are even more compelling, and, like, I think it's so important what you're showing about how hard these decisions are now, because of how short the timeline is now, because we only have, you know, 11 years to do the emissions reductions necessary to have a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the easiest way to say that, which sucks. But like, how hard, it's so hard to make a decision like that within that time frame. And what I'm trying to do with my thing is to make it known that it didn't have to be this hard, that we only just started taking this seriously very recently. We could have started taking it seriously 30 to 40 years ago, and these decisions wouldn't have been as hard. They wouldn't have been as financially ridiculous, right? And so that's the purpose of what I'm doing, is like, well, how do we hold the people accountable who got us into this situation? You know, like, how do we reveal that how we got, because how we got here is not fully revealed yet. You know, we have some, but there's so much more every single day that we can learn. And then there was all these attempts via lawsuits. There's 15 to 16 lawsuits all over the country trying to hold various industries accountable for the disinformation campaign so that local governments can get more funding to help deal with these problems. Because right now, I mean, this is a taxpayer problem. You know, like, how do we use this limited funds? Like, it's not, we didn't get 11 years just like because it's 11 years. Like it should have been 42 years. We should have had more money. But like now it's on the burden of taxpayers. And so I think it's really important to illustrate that.
You get the option to raise taxes in the game. It's really fun.
What happens?
Everyone needs you.
Yeah.
Everyone's like, oh. They all turn red.
It's usually after you've added sand twice and you don't have enough money to do it.
Sand tax.
Could you talk about time? All three of you we've got 2050 on one end, and I'd be interested in how you approached your subjects and said, actually had the nerve to say out loud, I'm going to be following you and your family till every 5 years till 2050. Rosanna, I take it yours was about a year, but I'd be interested exactly how much time. And did you only do this project, or did you have other pieces? And then Emily, you're the equivalent of a daily deadline. And a lot of people in the room are on 24/7. So be interested to how you thought about time, and particularly as you got more time, how you kind of keep a focus on it.
Yeah, I mean, time. I've been obsessed with with time lately, and it does seem like a huge time scale. To be clear, like sometimes people think that I'm holding all this footage back till 2050, and I'm like definitely not. I'm, like talking about it now because I think we have to have these conversations now, and there's an urgency in the right now. And a film will be released every 5 years. In terms of those conversations, like I think it helps that I've spent a lot of time in these communities before, like that it's not the first approach. And sometimes people are like, oh, that's interesting, or sometimes they're like, oh, you like might get hit by a bus between now and then, or like it becomes, there's like often this odd like joking mortality conversation that happens out of me saying that I want to do something until 2050. And very intentionally, it's not about one person in any place. Like there are place stories told through very zoomed in stories of individuals, but we're interviewing a lot of people in each location, because I think that it would be too much to put on like one individual or one family, like carry the story of this place and be documented in that way. I also think like the negative space in terms of time is really important. Like someone, I can't remember who said this to me, but I was explaining this idea to them and they were like, oh, it's like the uncle effect. And I was like, what is that? And they said, it's like when you go back for like Thanksgiving or like a holiday, and if you're the uncle and you haven't seen your nieces and nephews in, a year or two, you notice how much they've changed, and you make some sort of comment that the niece and nephew like then hate about like, you're so big, like whatever. But I think you need to like step away and then come back in order to combat the idea of shifting baselines. So, I've been thinking a lot about ways to stay in touch with these communities in between, but I don't want to be like constantly harassing them. That's actually something that people, like scientists, like who did the Harvard nurses study, which is a multi-decade health study on nurses, they make a real effort to stay in touch with their subjects in a real way that is not just when they need something, so that it is a back and forth and an actual human relationship and not just taking.
I listened a lot. I think that I am lucky in the sense that I have a beat where it's enterprise focused. I did a lot of beat reporting throughout the process. I'm the coastal oceans beat reporter. But I think when you go into a city council meeting not stressed about writing that one 12-inch story that's on deadline, you listen a lot more, you absorb, and at some point after going to 10 of these city council meetings in 10 different cities, you start seeing universal patterns and themes. And I think I really picked up on the emotional aspect of this issue. I get it. The town of Pacifica is south of San Francisco. And why does San Francisco get a $500 million seawall? That obviously is really important because everyone loves the Embarcadero, but this small town doesn't get to exist in the next 20 years. And as you start hearing this in other cities too that are like the LAs versus the Pacificas, I think patterns start to emerge. But I did, the way most of our environment reporters are project-based, but I'm always working on kind of a long-term project like the Sea Level Rise project. I'm working on an enterprise story that's a feature that will run kind of on the weekend, and then I'm always working on kind of a daily beat reporting type story, but with the purpose of sourcing and understanding a community versus feeding the beast and feeding the news cycle. And I think that listening is really important, empathy is really important, and just getting out there and running into the homeowners in the women's bathroom between breaks at a city council meeting that ran 9 hours long. You meet a lot of really interesting people and like get to know them in a different way as you're washing your hands after like, a long day. Sorry.
That guy does not wash his hands.
But I think, but it's just like, the kind of conversations you have, like they no longer saw me as like the reporter who's out to devalue their properties. And I no longer saw them as the homeowners who were fighting for something that was, I don't want to say inevitable because I have learned a lot from this conference on wording, but it just, I think empathy was really important. And in terms of time, it took about 8 to 9 months of just chipping away at just what I noticed as I was going up and down the coast on other beat reporting type stories. I produced a lot on the side. And I think it was last November, December in the holidays when my editor and I like holed up in the conference room, mapped out the decision tree for the game, really executed the like nut graph and decided it was going to be 1 story, not 3 stories. And then from January to like June was when I really sat down, wrote the story, figured out which towns I was going to go back to and reprofile, re-interview which characters I was actually going to spend a week of time with and go on their walks with them and understand, meet all their dogs and just be in their lives. And I think that time that you spend with people really shows in the reporting. And I know that's something that we don't all have the luxury to do, but that was really important in telling a story that people connected to.
One thing I just noticed briefly is that, we've been talking a lot about like how depressing, gloom and doom, and then also hope stories, but there are so many other emotions that are associated with climate stories. Like I focus on anger, but like a lot of this has been really funny. And it's unfortunate, like dark humor, like kind of like it's one of those like, ooh, because in your game, with all the guys being like, oh no, the sea's coming. And you're just this like mortality joke. I mean, we don't have to be so serious about the end of the world. You know what I'm saying? It's just it's an opportunity for creativity, right? This is about creative and compelling climate stories. And I think the hilarious dark humor aspect of it is kind of, it's notable. In terms of the timing question, obviously 4 newsletters a week means 4 stories a week, which is a lot, but if you came up in the digital media space, you'll know that, I had a job where I had to write 4 stories a day. So 4 stories a week is like awesome. And the reason it's 4 stories a week is so that I have an extra day or two to work on my longer term ones. So maybe we'll have one day where an issue is like 800 words, a lot of aggregation. Like it took me a few hours. It just only took me a few hours to do. And that's so I can spend more time reporting the big ones. Like I have to manage my time effectively, but it just means that people can't handle 4 huge stories a week anyway. They want some they want small, some they want big. So it's just a balance. I don't know if I'll be able to sustain it for the rest of my life. Probably not, but yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Question for all of you. You've been reporting on this issue for a really long time. Is there anything you've ever reported on and thinking, okay, there's just something, and people like really responded to it and were really interested in the way it surprised you?
I'll start. So I just published this article that it was a column 1 feature. We have a series that's basically room for every beat reporter in the newsroom to pitch wacky, unconventional stories and unconventional ways of telling it. There's this, do you guys know what abalone are? They're like these gigantic, really derpy looking marine snails that people in California are obsessed with. And they're kind of like lobsters in Maine or blue crab in Maryland. They were so a part of our cultural heritage. People went diving for them. They are like very endangered in California now, to the point where when I moved to Southern California 10 years ago, I had no idea what they were because they were already gone. So there's a team of scientists who have been found 2 in the wild, figured out for years like how to breed them because they went basically extinct before we knew how they reproduced, and they're now planting them in the ocean. So it was this like really wacky feature about these scientists who are obsessed with these marine snails and are really trying to bring back this California heritage. And it's a story about climate change because these abalone are endangered and cannot survive because there are not a lot left from overfishing, but the few that are left cannot survive in a more acidic ocean, a warming ocean. And, we had to move the lab all the way up to Bodega Bay, which is like North California, because the water was so warm in their native habitats. And the amount of wacky marine animal people that came out of the woodwork who suddenly really cared about climate change and how to save these species when they don't even care about the human species was fascinating. Like, I got so many emails about what they could do, how they can, like, what's ocean acidification? Like, it was fascinating how this story became an entryway into ocean acidification, warming oceans, sea level rise, and like, why are the abalone dying? And it was a very interesting audience that I did not know existed, but it was a great opportunity to engage with them.
What did you tell them what to do?
I sent them links on ocean acidification. We've done really good coverage on that as well. And, I think you do have to have conversations with your readers. I think we've been talking about transparency as well. So, it's just continuing that conversation, sending them other stories, and just trying to make it more accessible now that they have that interest and not putting up a wall.
So I'll tell you like a non-animal story. I feel like animal stories like always
Brink. It's like the new polar bear.
I was at SCGA, like Society of Environmental Journalists, like a year ago, and someone came up to me, they saw my name tag, they're like, "Oh, you're that pangolin guy." I did this investigation on pangolin trafficking, which you should Google if you.
Oh, it's so awful.
So one thing that I'll say is like just in like a word in for journey stories, like in the same way that I feel like following a newsletter or your reporting like is like a journey for the reader. I did a story in California on the San Joaquin River several years ago, and it had been named the most endangered river in the country. It's a really messed up waterway. It's dry for 40 miles in the middle of it because agriculture basically takes all the water and diverts it into canals. And so I decided to tell that story. I don't know why my editors agreed to this by kayaking down the whole thing. and then walking through the dry part, I locked the kayak to with a bike lock to a fence and was walking and live tweeting this whole thing to tell people about what I was doing and to try to help people understand California water policy through a particular path. And the weird thing happened is that people started finding me in real life. I all of a sudden was kayaking in the middle of nowhere, no one is around, and I hear someone yell my name, and they're on top of this 30-foot water tower right by the river, and she'd been waiting there because she saw from the location of my tweets where I was, and she wanted to talk about her family farm, and that was really helpful. I made it into the story, even if it scared me, and I'm glad that no one who hated me showed up to talk. But that happened several times. So I'm just saying that as an example of, I think when you throw a journey or a quest out into the world, and discovery and reporting is a type of quest, allies sort of emerge out of everywhere. So I always I like the idea of being open about what you're working on and what you're trying to figure out, even if you're not done yet, because it does bring people to you.
Yeah, in that same vein, I put up that Amazon freezer bag story. That's a journey story, but it was a journey that took place entirely in my apartment because I was busy and I was oh, I gotta get some groceries and get them delivered here, and I got this bag and I was just what is this bag? And so so I called Amazon, I emailed Amazon, I got answers that weren't really great, but then then I got this one that's oh, it's mixed number 7. So I'm okay, what's mixed number 7? And I called the local recycling place. They're we don't take mixed number 7. I'm okay, but maybe over here. And so that's the whole story is that. And then I call this recycling expert who's send me a picture. That's not recyclable. No recycling place takes that. So the whole place is just a journey of me starting and being there's got to be something. And then at the end, it's I was there's nothing, And that was one, when I surveyed readers, overwhelmingly, that was the one that people cited the most. And the other things that people cite the most are honestly the ones that are the most boring and annoying to do in the moment. The ones where you're just citing through, going through a database to find, one of my most successful stories was about sewage overflows in Florida after Hurricane Irma, where I went and I was just okay, I guess I'll go through every single sewage overflow public reported document in Florida after Irma, put them in a spreadsheet and tally up all of it. It took me so long. It was such an annoying process, but you got this awful number of sewage overflows, and it was it blew up. So I think generally anything that feels really awful doing in the moment is probably going to be worthwhile.
Walking 40 miles.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.